Yeah, before we watch the movie, 6 o'clock news, I wanted to talk about this place, the Santa Monica Camera Obscura, which is specifically the dark box that you see on the left. So what's inside that box? This drawing is pretty close to what you'll find in Santa Monica. It's a dark room where you stand around a round table and watch a real-time projection of the outside world. And that projection enters the room through a turret in the roof, which has a lens and a mirror. I originally learned about this place from the movie we're about to watch, and I would ride my bike over there from UCLA. The Camera Obscura was attached to a senior center then, but sadly both the senior center and the Camera Obscura have been closed since 2020. So I recently made a video attempting to shame Santa Monica into reopening it. And they haven't reopened it, but they did invite me to come see the Camera Obscura, which is still functional. And here's what it looked like during my visit. The projection is a bit dim because it was overcast, but you can get a sense of the quality of the image. It's ethereal, it's not real life, not film, not video, it's something else. There's a ship's wheel that you can use to rotate the turret, and that's what's changing the view. Here's what the mechanism looks like as it's rotated. I would always have the strangest experiences when I came here. I remember meeting a couple of tourists from Winnipeg one time, and we had this incredibly intimate hour-long conversation where we discovered all these really deep things we had in common, and then we never spoke again. It was like it was all a dream. There's something very magical about this place, even just the way it works. So this effect happens naturally in any dark room with a small opening. As you can see in this diagram, the projection is naturally flipped both vertically and horizontally. And that's because light always moves in a straight line. So if you follow line A from the top of the tree, go down through the hole, it continues down, it becomes the bottom of the projection. In Santa Monica, there's a mirror that flips this projection. The Camera Obscura has been in this building since 1955. Before that, it was in an older building built in 1901. But it started out right on the beach in 1898, and it actually still uses the same optical mechanism it did back then. Catalina had a Camera Obscura, and so did Angel's Flight. It's up there on that incredible observation tower, which was torn down in 1931, obviously kicking off downtown's decline. The black spot that you see on the top of the deck there, that's the turret. So why were these built in the first place? Why didn't people just admire the view directly? That's a question I had when I was making my video, so I started researching it. And it turns out the answer is not that straightforward. As for the one in Santa Monica, it was part of the North Beach Bathhouse, which was the premier Santa Monica resort in the 1890s, 1900s. This is just south of where the Santa Monica Pier is today. It had these hot and cold saltwater baths that doctors recommended for ailments like eczema, asthma, and nervous weakness, which was also called Americanitis. Today we would call it burnout or depression. Bathhouses like this were common in beach resorts around this time. In fact, tourism in Santa Monica originated with a bathhouse. Here was the first one, built in the 1870s when the city was still mostly ranch land. Tourism took off slowly in Santa Monica because they were also trying to become LA's port. Henry Huntington built this, the Long Wharf, in 1891. It's where Will Rogers State Beach is today. When San Pedro was chosen as the port in 1899, that sealed Santa Monica's fate. They would go all in on tourism. So they built grand hotels like the Arcadia right next to North Beach Bathhouse. Abbot Kinney built Ocean Park, which was an entire neighborhood of hundreds of homes, an enormous Moorish bathhouse, and a 1,200-foot-long pleasure pier. A few years later, the Santa Monica Pier was built. The amusement area on the left was added in 1916. And 8 years later, they added La Monica Ballroom at the end of the pier. It was the largest ballroom in the world. And they had live music and dancing 7 nights a week. They just kept adding on more and more. Here's what the Ocean Park Pier eventually became. These were huge complexes of theaters, rides, sideshows, hotels, and restaurants. And we haven't even looked at Venice. From 1900 to 1920, LA was essentially a tourist town. That's how it was perceived by the rest of the country, who would read about it in letters sent from tourists back to their hometown newspapers. Here's an example from Vermont in 1906. This person dedicated an entire paragraph to the Camera Obscura. I found several examples of this, and in each letter they had the same exact itinerary. That's because they took the streetcars. So there was this route called the balloon route that was recommended to tourists. They would go to the Camera Obscura after visiting the Soldiers' Home, which is today the VA, and before going to Moonstone Beach in Redondo, where they would collect gemstones on the sand. Tourism in Los Angeles was also driven by the railroads, who advertised the city aggressively across the country and within LA. This ad promoted Southern Pacific trains from downtown to the beaches, and it reads, "Camera Obscura on beach. Get jokes on friends. Live alligator at mountain lion." I couldn't find any information on the last part, and I did look, but I assume they were like emotional support animals. Mountain lions in particular are super good for nervous weakness. As for get jokes on friends, we're gonna come back to that. Santa Monica's style of tourism was totally modeled off British seaside tourism. And this is really where mass tourism, accessible by all classes, first emerged. Because after all, England was the first country to industrialize and the first country to build extensive railways, including to the sea. And it was in these British seaside towns where the Camera Obscura first became a tourist attraction. But since it's a natural phenomenon, the Camera Obscura goes back much, much further. This is a Stone Age tomb in Wales. There's hundreds of these around the UK. This one's about 5,000 years old. Recently, archaeologists have been investigating these tombs, and they found that if you hang an animal skin in the entrance, they can function quite well as a Camera Obscura. It seems plausible this was by design. We do know the effect has always mesmerized people. It was first formally documented by Aristotle in the 4th century BC. He noticed that it happened naturally when light passed through small gaps, like in foliage, and that it was a safe way to observe a solar eclipse, which is what you see happening here. This is pretty amazing. So 700 years ago, the Camera Obscura was used to make cinema. So an audience would go inside a Camera Obscura, and then a staged battle or hunt scene would take place outside. And the audience would watch the projection of that while someone inside made sound effects. I found a few other instances of this, but it was seemingly quite rare. The Camera Obscura was more often associated with astronomy, especially after it was improved with lenses and mirrors in the 1550s. It was used to observe eclipses and sunspots. Soon, artists began using it as a tracing device. Here's a model from the 1640s where you could trace two different scenes projected from either side of the structure. Artists also made portable versions. This model is called a picture box. And its inventor wrote that it could be used to, quote, take a picture of anything. The wording is so interesting. That's in 1694. The pioneering surgeon William Cheselden is pictured here using a portable Camera Obscura to draw bones for his book Osteographia, which was the first complete depiction of the human skeletal system. These are some of the drawings he produced using the Camera Obscura. Some of these portable Camera Obscuras are basically indistinguishable from early cameras. All it would take is adding light-sensitive emulsion. So we could have had photography as early as, say, 1700. When photography did finally arrive in 1827, it was very much conceived of as an attempt to permanently capture the image from a Camera Obscura. And there's one more application of the Camera Obscura I want to talk about, and that's as a metaphor for the eye. How does the eye work? This was such an important intellectual challenge. Da Vinci, Kepler, and Descartes all wrote about it, and all of them compared the eye to the Camera Obscura. This is a drawing by Descartes. He was one of the first to show that our vision is inverted. And yeah, the eye works just like the Camera Obscura. Light passes through a lens and onto a projection surface. In our eye, that's the retina. In Santa Monica, that's the round table. Now remember, the Camera Obscura relies on mirrors to flip the image. For us, our brain does that, and it's a skill that we acquire as infants. And what's crazy is that it can be unlearned. Researchers have proven, like in this 1950 experiment, that if you wear goggles that flip your vision upside down, you can fully adapt in about a week. And it's not just that he's used to seeing things upside down. His brain is actually flipping the upside down goggle image right side up. And once he takes them off, he needs to readapt. But that's subject to seeing things upside down once more. So what does this prove? It proves that what we see belongs to the body, and what we perceive belongs to the mind. This is why the study of vision, and specifically the finding that it's inverted, was so important to Descartes. It was a way to prove Cartesian dualism, his concept of the separation between mind and body. For most of human history, this idea was more of an abstraction. We experienced the world as active participants. But that changes in the Victorian era when we begin experiencing it as passive spectators. And we shift from this collective view that there's a single shared truth to the idea that we're individual, introspective minds with different perceptions of reality, basically the way we see the world today. There are all kinds of developments that propel this shift, including urbanization, which enables these new grand spectacles like the World's Fair. Here, the individual is totally subsumed by the crowd, and unlike the chaotic fairs of medieval times, your presence here as a visitor doesn't affect what you experience in any way. The Camera Obscura does this on an individual level. When you go into the Camera Obscura, you're hidden away from the world in a kind of fortress. This is one of its key features. No one outside can see you. No one knows what you're looking at. And that was central to how it was perceived in the Victorian era. So earlier we saw that ad that said, "Get jokes on friends." So here's a cartoon from 1890 that shows a group of tourists using the Camera Obscura to spy on a couple who think they're having a private moment. The experience was this blend of voyeurism and comedy. Often there was a narrator who would poke fun at people outside. And this is right on the heels of photography becoming accessible to the masses. And one of the first things people do with that is they print and trade these visiting cards with their photos on them. So we're moving rapidly away from the world as something we mostly experience through in-person interaction toward one that's mediated through images and intermediaries. The Camera Obscura was popular with the British also because they saw nature as something best appreciated through some kind of mediation. The picturesque movement taught the British to enjoy nature by seeking out certain views, ones that adhered to specific rules of composition. And they actually built physical structures to enforce this. This example is the Lake District, and it's a tiny building that exists solely to house a window that frames the correct view of a waterfall. These structures quickly evolved into the dedicated viewpoints we've all experienced in national parks and forests. So next time you see one of these, just remember, you are being coerced. The British also used the portable device to properly enjoy nature. It was called a clod glass, and it was basically a darkened, slightly convex round mirror. You would actually turn your back to the vista and look at it through this mirror instead. It was used widely both by tourists and amateur artists. They felt that it made the view look more like a painting by a great master. Like the clod glass, the Camera Obscura was a way to frame the view and put a kind of filter on it to better appreciate it. Over the course of its history, observers often wrote that the Camera Obscura's projection was even more lifelike than life itself, which I think speaks not just to the uncanny quality of the image, but the way your isolation inside the Camera Obscura forces you to meditate on it. Bummer that it's closed, especially after hundreds of years of relevance. Now, they've assured me they do want to reopen it, but budget cuts, personal cuts, it's not easy. So the strategy right now is actually to pitch it to a few foreign countries to be their hospitality house during the Olympics. This was Denmark's in Rio. Let that sink in. We are depending on a foreign government to pay for something this small. Fucking A. So post-2020, the Camera Obscura takes on yet another role, a canary in the coal mine for American civic health. But I get it. Even in 2004, before smartphones, Santa Monica reported a mere 40 visitors a week. The Camera Obscura has become an antiquated niche oddity, an obvious thing to defund. Isn't that antiquated though? We still create and seek out similar experiences. I think about James Turrell's Sky Spaces or Lamont Young's Dream House. When I lived in New York, I would go there regularly. You sit in this room and listen to an electronic drone made of dozens of clashing frequencies. And I always found that if you listen long enough, when you get back out on the street, you suddenly hear the entire soundscape, all these things that your brain normally filters out. The Camera Obscura does that visually. And given how overwhelming life can be today, with our steady barrage of notifications, photos, videos, the constant Substack emails, this kind of reset is arguably more useful than ever. But perhaps what's most revealing about the history of the Camera Obscura is that we've always needed that reset. And that brings us to 6 o'clock news. If the Camera Obscura frames and filters our visual reality, the news frames and filters our social and political reality. It doesn't just inform us, it distorts our sense of the world, often filling us with fear and anxiety. With this film, Ross McElwee took that fear and turned it into a meditation on representation, chance, and fate. Today, the news is even less trustworthy than it was then, in 1996. We have openly partisan outlets, deliberate misinformation, deep fakes. So while the 6 o'clock news as a format has faded in significance, McElwee's questions are more relevant than ever. So with that, let's start the film. Thank you.